Welcome to Mill History Talk, the podcast where strategy meets storytelling, unpacking the drama, decisions, and disasters of war so you understand not just what happened, but why it still matters. The views expressed on Mill History Talk are those of the hosts, writers, and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any government agency, military organization, or institution. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. Welcome back to Mill History Talk. In Part 1, we watched the aircraft carrier survive the nuclear age, the revolt of the admirals, and Korea. Now we get to the part where success becomes complicated.
This is Episode 80, The Aircraft Carrier in the Cold War, Part 2. We begin in Vietnam, move into the Soviet naval challenge and maritime strategy, and finish in 1991, when carrier aviation experienced both apparent vindication and a profound institutional reckoning.
So, Yankee Station, Dixie Station, the Forrestal fire, TOPGUN, mining Haiphong, Soviet submarines, backfires, Aegis, multi-carrier battle groups, Desert Storm, and Tailhook.
A modest 35 minutes.
Right. We have learned something from Rolling Thunder, mostly not to measure progress by how many times we repeat the same point.
Episode 79 ended with an important qualification. Korea proved carriers could provide immediate, sustained air power when the United States controlled the surrounding sea. It did not prove they could survive against a peer maritime opponent.
Vietnam will reinforce the first lesson. The Soviet Union will force the Navy to confront the second.
The story of the late Cold War carrier is not a simple rise, fall, and rebirth. It is a sequence of different strategic problems. Vietnam asked whether carriers could sustain combat for years under political constraint. The Soviet challenge asked whether they could survive and fight in a contested ocean. Navy culture then asked what happens when one community becomes identified with the service's most visible measure of war-fighting excellence.
The carrier performed remarkably well in all three arenas. That is important because this is not an argument that carriers were obsolete or that naval aviation somehow failed. The harder question is what an institution learns from repeated success and whether it notices when the conditions producing that success have changed.
We will let the evidence carry that argument rather than repeating it. Vietnam first. By the mid-1960s, carrier aviation entered Vietnam with a force transformed by jets, larger carriers, improved flight decks, better electronics, and a decade of routine forward deployment. The basic political attraction remained the same. Sea-based air power could arrive quickly, operate without building a new permanent base, and be increased or reduced without the diplomatic footprint of another large installation ashore.
That flexibility fit the Johnson administration's approach almost perfectly. The United States wanted to apply pressure to North Vietnam while controlling escalation. That meant air power delivered in increments. Targets approved, targets withheld, pauses imposed, pressure increased, pressure reduced.
Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965 and continued at varying intensity until the bombing halt over North Vietnam in November 1968. Navy and Marine aircraft flew more than 152,000 attack sorties during the campaign. Carriers operating from Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin were a central part of that effort.
And here's the thing. There was another operating area that often disappears from the shorthand history. Dixie Station, off South Vietnam. For periods in 1965 and 1966, carrier aircraft there supported ground operations in the south, while Yankee Station concentrated attention northward.
The distinction matters. Yankee Station became synonymous with strikes into North Vietnam. Dixie Station reflected the carrier's other Cold War role, close air support and direct support of troops ashore. The same mobile airfield could shift between very different missions.
But once you say mobile airfield, you also see the paradox. Mobility was one of the carrier's great advantages, yet the war increasingly asked carriers to report to established operating areas, follow recurring cycles, and feed aircraft into a centrally controlled air campaign.
That system was effective at producing sorties. It was less effective at producing strategic decision. Rolling Thunder deliberately limited the speed and scope of escalation. Important targets were sometimes restricted, targeting authority was centralized, and pauses were used as political signals. North Vietnam gained time to disperse supplies, strengthen air defenses, repair damage, and learn American patterns.
The carrier did not create that strategy. It was simply unusually well suited to it. A president could move a carrier, add another one, surge flying, pause flying, or pull a ship away. The platform gave civilian leaders an adjustable military instrument.
I'd make a distinction there. That is a real strategic virtue. Political control is not automatically a flaw. Military force exists to serve political purpose.
Absolutely. And that's the key point. The problem begins when controllability becomes confused with effectiveness. A tool can perform exactly as ordered and still fail to produce the political result the strategy expects.
Vietnam would test that distinction for nearly a decade. Operationally, these carriers were organized under 7th Fleet, with Task Force 77 providing the principal fast carrier striking force. The designation matters because Yankee Station can make the war sound like a collection of individual ships. In reality, it was a rotating fleet system. Carriers, escorts, tankers, ammunition ships, rescue forces, reconnaissance assets, and command staffs maintaining a continuous combat presence.
And the air wing itself was not one generic block of Navy jets. A Vietnam-era deck might carry F-4 Phantoms for fleet defense and air-to-air work, A-4 Skyhawks, A-6 Intruders, and later A-7 Corsair IIs for attack, E-2 Hawkeyes for airborne warning, reconnaissance aircraft, and electronic warfare platforms. By 1972, an enterprise strike could combine A-6s, A-7s, EA-6 electronic warfare aircraft, E-2Cs, and reconnaissance support in the same package.
That diversity is important. Carrier power came from the air wing as a combined system. The Intruder could attack and weather in darkness. The Corsair II improved attack range and payload efficiency. The Phantom combined fleet air defense with strike capability. Hawkeyes extended awareness beyond the ship's horizon. Electronic warfare aircraft helped suppress or confuse defenses.
So, put another way, the carrier is less like a single weapon and more like a toolbox that moves at 30 knots. But every additional capability also increases the complexity of keeping the deck synchronized, the maintenance system supplied, and the people trained.
Individual deployments could be punishing. In one 1968 cruise, Constellation's air wing recorded more than 6,500 combat sorties and over 4,400 support missions. Numbers like that help explain why endurance became such a powerful part of carrier identity. The Navy could point to something measurable. Day after day, month after month, the system kept producing combat power. Sustaining carrier operations off Vietnam required industrial discipline. Aircraft had to be fueled, armed, launched, recovered, inspected, repaired, and launched again. Aviation fuel and ordnance moved continuously. Spare parts crossed oceans. Underway replenishment kept carriers at sea. The flight deck became the visible end of a much larger logistics system.
This is where the glamour reel lies by omission. The fighter launches, the camera follows it into the sky, and the audience sees the pilot. The actual sortie began with thousands of people: ordnance crews, fuel handlers, maintainers, catapult crews, air traffic controllers, cooks, supply specialists, engineers, medical teams, and the ships bringing everything the carrier consumed.
Logistics again declines to remain off camera.
It always finds the lens eventually.
The work was dangerous even before an aircraft reached enemy airspace. 3 major carrier fires within 30 months underscored that fact. On Oriskany in October 1966, a fire killed 44 men. On Forrestal, on July 29, 1967, an accidental Zuni rocket launch triggered explosions and a catastrophic flight deck fire that killed 134 sailors and aviators, injured 161, and destroyed 21 aircraft. Enterprise suffered another major fire in January 1969 that killed 28.
Yeah, Those numbers matter because sortie generation can sound sterile. Forrestal was preparing heavily armed aircraft for another strike from Yankee Station. In minutes, the machinery of sustained air power became a fight to save the ship and the people trapped inside it.
The Navy learned from the disaster. Firefighting, damage control training, ordnance handling, protective equipment, and flight deck procedures changed. Some lessons, painfully, were lessons the service had known during World War II and had allowed to fade.
That is institutional learning in its least theoretical form. Failure arrives with smoke, casualties, and no patience for bureaucratic euphemism.
Combat losses carried another human cost. Lieutenant Junior Grade Everett Alvarez Jr., flying an A-4 Skyhawk from Constellation, was shot down over North Vietnam in August 1964. He became the first U.S. naval aviator held prisoner in North Vietnam and spent more than 8 years in captivity.
One man's 8 years makes the phrase protracted air war land differently.
Hundreds of Navy aircraft were lost in combat over Southeast Asia, with additional losses to accidents and operational causes. Every lost aircraft represented more than an entry in an attrition table: a crew killed, missing, captured, rescued, or injured. A squadron absorbing the loss, maintainers and shipmates continuing the next cycle.
And yet, the decks kept operating. That endurance was extraordinary. It deserves admiration. It also explains why the Navy came out of Vietnam convinced that the carrier system itself had worked, even when the larger strategy had not.
Vietnam was not a story of simple doctrinal stagnation. Naval aviation adapted aggressively when it encountered tactical failure. Air-to-air combat provides the clearest example.
Early in the war, missile age assumptions met actual MiGs. Training had shifted away from sustained dissimilar air combat. Missile reliability was disappointing. Rules of engagement often forced visual identification, which reduced some of the theoretical advantages of beyond visual range weapons.
In 1968, Captain Frank Ault led a major review of Navy air-to-air performance. The resulting Ault report examined aircraft, weapons, maintenance, training, and tactics. One of its most famous consequences was the establishment in 1969 of the Navy Fighter Weapons School, TOPGUN.
Which is a useful reminder that Top Gun was not created because aviators needed better sunglasses.
Historians continue to disappoint the wardrobe department.
The important point is that the Navy identified a measurable failure and attacked it directly. Better training, more realistic opposition, tactical standardization, improved missile employment, and better maintenance all mattered. By the 1972 fighting, Navy air-to-air performance improved dramatically.
Training deserves substantial credit, but we should avoid turning Top Gun into a single-cause legend. Improved Sidewinder variants, weapons maintenance, tactical circumstances, and experience also contributed. Institutional learning is usually less cinematic than the movie version.
Look at Brian protecting us from a tidy narrative. I approve.
Please record the date.
I will.
The larger air war also changed in 1972. Linebacker 1, beginning during the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive, was a broad interdiction campaign and involved heavy naval participation. Linebacker 2 in December was a distinct 11-day strategic bombing effort centered much more heavily on Air Force B-52 operations. Treating them as one campaign obscures important differences.
Before we move on, there is one naval aviation operation that best complicates our entire thesis: pocket money.
On May 9, 1972, aircraft from Coral Sea began mining the approaches to Haiphong. A-6 Intruders and A-7 Corsair IIs laid magnetic acoustic mines, and other North Vietnamese ports were subsequently mined. More than 85% of North Vietnam's military imports moved through those ports.
Exactly. That is not merely carrier aircraft bombing land targets. That is maritime denial. It is the Navy using carrier aviation to close an enemy's access to the sea. In other words, a sea control function reappearing inside a war we usually describe as strike warfare.
And it was strategically consequential. Mining sharply constrained seaborne resupply and connected naval aviation to blockade, interdiction, and the broader pressure on North Vietnam in 1972.
It also connects directly to our episodes on submarines and the merchant marine. Sea power is not only about destroying fleets, it is about movement, protecting yours and denying the enemy's. Pocket money attacked the movement that sustained North Vietnam.
So Vietnam produced two apparently contradictory lessons. The carrier could become a predictable floating airbase feeding a prolonged land campaign. It could also execute adaptive, distinctly maritime operations with strategic effect.
Which means the right conclusion is not Vietnam proved the Navy forgot sea control. It is narrower. The dominant institutional experience rewarded endurance and strike, even though important exceptions showed a broader range of possibilities.
By the 1970s, the Soviet Navy was transforming the maritime problem. Under Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the Soviet Union built a force designed not to imitate the American carrier navy, but to attack the assumptions on which American naval operations depended.
Submarines threatened carriers and Atlantic reinforcement routes. Long-range maritime bombers could launch anti-ship missiles from well outside the immediate battle group. Surface ships and submarines carried increasingly capable cruise missiles. Soviet reconnaissance tried to solve the central targeting problem: find the carrier, keep track of it, and pass accurate information to the shooters.
The Soviet force also protected ballistic missile submarines in defended regions commonly described as bastions, especially in the Barents Sea and Sea of Okhotsk. These were areas where geography, air power, submarines, surface forces, and shore-based support could make American penetration costly.
And suddenly, the carrier's freedom of movement was no longer an assumption. It became the thing the Navy had to fight to preserve.
That strategic shift contributed to the development of what became known as Maritime Strategy in the late 1970s and 1980s. Rather than hold carriers safely back from the Soviet threat, the strategy envisioned forward operations into the Norwegian Sea, the North Pacific, and other contested regions, to seize initiative and threaten Soviet forces close to their own defensive zones.
This was almost the inverse of Yankee Station. Instead of accepting a predictable operating area because the sea was secure, carriers would maneuver aggressively because the sea was contested.
Carrier aviation again became part of sea control. Fighters defended the force. Attack aircraft threatened Soviet ships and bases. Airborne early warning extended the fleet's eyes. Electronic warfare protected strike packages and disrupted enemy sensors. Anti-submarine forces worked to submarine threat. The carrier sat inside a larger battle force rather than operating as an isolated airfield. The technology of the late Cold War carrier air wing was shaped directly by this threat. The F-14 Tomcat and its AWG-9 radar could employ the long-range AIM-54 Phoenix missile against multiple targets, giving the battle group a chance to attack Soviet bombers before they reached missile release positions. The objective was not glamorous dogfighting. It was to kill the archers before they launched the arrows.
And that phrase gets to the geometry of the problem. If a Soviet bomber could fire a long-range anti-ship missile from hundreds of miles away, shooting down the missile after launch was the last line of defense. Better to find and destroy the bomber first. Better still, to disrupt the reconnaissance and targeting chain that told the bomber where the carrier was.
The same logic applied underwater. Soviet attack submarines and missile submarines threatened the battle group from different axes and complicated maneuver. American submarines, maritime patrol aircraft, surface escorts, and carrier-based anti-submarine assets worked to push that threat outward. The carrier's survival depended on winning a reconnaissance and targeting contest across air, surface, subsurface, space, and electronic domains.
That is why the phrase carrier battle group matters more than carrier. The ship everyone photographs is only the visible center. The war-fighting problem is the whole formation and the invisible networks connecting it.
It also explains why late Cold War exercises were strategically important. Operating carriers in the Norwegian Sea or the North Pacific was not simply a demonstration of seamanship. It was an attempt to prove that the fleet could function close enough to Soviet power to threaten forces Moscow expected to protect, while forcing the Soviet Union to devote aircraft, submarines, sensors, and command attention to defense.
Here is where I start to worry. The Navy confronted a Soviet anti-carrier system and answered by building an even larger system around the carrier. More escorts, more sensors, more fighters, more networks, more logistics. Everything focused on keeping the centerpiece alive and lethal. That can become circular. The carrier is central because the fleet is built around it, and the fleet must remain built around it because so much capability now exists to support it.
I think that criticism goes too far. Against the Soviet Union, carrier centrality was not simply cultural habit, it was strategically rational. The United States needed mobile tactical air power that could operate without assuming access to continental bases. Carriers could threaten Soviet naval aviation, support anti-submarine operations, protect reinforcement routes, and put pressure on the Soviet periphery. A distributed fleet of smaller platforms in the technology of the 1980s could not simply reproduce that capability.
Okay, but concentrating enormous military and political value in a handful of ships also gave the Soviets a very clear problem to solve. Locate the carrier, mass enough weapons, saturate the defenses.
That's fair, but war is not an exercise in removing every vulnerability. It is about creating more severe problems for the opponent than the opponent can create for you. Forward carrier groups forced the Soviets to defend bombers, submarines, bastions, and approaches they would otherwise use offensively. That complicated their planning and strengthened conventional deterrence.
Fair enough, I'll give you that. Maritime strategy was not just protect the carrier. It used the carrier to impose dilemmas. My concern is what happened afterward. Whether success against that particular Soviet problem became evidence that the same basic answer should dominate every future maritime problem.
That is the better criticism. A force design can be strategically correct for one era and still become a constraint if its original assumptions are forgotten.
Excellent. A disagreement where nobody throws a chair, and we end up with a narrower argument. Professional military education survives another day.
The late Cold War carrier battle force depended on integration. The Naval Tactical Data System helped ships and aircraft share sensor information. E-2 Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft extended the radar picture. F-14 Tomcats with long-range Phoenix missiles were designed in part to intercept Soviet bombers before they could release anti-ship missiles. Electronic warfare aircraft complicated enemy detection and targeting.
And the surface escorts became increasingly capable. Aegis cruisers combined phased array radar, computing, and missile control to track and engage numerous air threats. The idea was layered defense. Kill the threat as far away from the carrier as possible, then make every surviving attacker pass through another defensive layer.
Submarines operated ahead of the force. Fighters and interceptors formed outer air defense. Surface combatants provided area defense. Point defense systems protected individual ships. Intelligence and communications attempted to connect the whole architecture,
which created extraordinary capability and a new dependency. If the sensors, links, identification processes, or communications were disrupted, the battle force could lose some of the coordination that made its concentration survivable.
Soviet doctrine sought exactly that kind of stress. Reconnaissance, electronic warfare, deception, multiple attack axes, submarines, and massed missile salvos were intended to compress American decision time and saturate defenses.
And this is where I keep coming back to the same problem. The Cold War ended without a naval shooting war. The United States built an impressive answer to a terrifying problem. We never received the final examination.
Multi-carrier operations were part of that answer. 2 or more carrier battle groups could combine air wings, provide mutual support, complicate enemy targeting, and mass offensive power. Large exercises demonstrated that American carriers would not automatically retreat from northern waters or the Western Pacific when threatened.
Deterrence by showing the Soviets that if the doors opened, the Navy planned to walk toward the noise.
With several $1 billion of aviation and a substantial escort package.
Multi-carrier operations also capture the fundamental trade-off. Concentration creates power and creates targets. There was no magic solution. The Navy chose to accept concentration risk in exchange for offensive mass and mutual defense.
And because deterrence succeeded, or because the Soviet system collapsed before deterrence failed, we cannot separate those explanations cleanly. The strategy's advocates can reasonably say it contributed to a credible conventional posture. Critics can reasonably say the operational assumptions were never tested under the conditions for which they were designed. By the late Cold War, carrier aviation had become not only a capability, but a powerful component of Navy identity. Aviators commanded highly visible forces, competed successfully for senior leadership positions, and operated the platforms most often associated in public with American naval power.
That matters because military services are not neutral organizations selecting tools from a catalog. They have cultures. They have preferred ways of describing warfare. They have career paths that signal what the institution admires.
Strategist Carl Bilder would later describe military services as institutions with distinct personalities and identities that shape the capabilities and missions they prefer. Naval aviation provides a strong example. Tactical proficiency, flight qualifications, landing performance, strike leadership, and command of aviation organizations became powerful markers of professional credibility.
Organizational theorists have other labels for the danger that can follow: competency traps, core rigidity, success lock-in. The basic idea is simple. You become extremely good at something, and that competence makes it harder to imagine circumstances where doing something else might be better.
But the competence itself was real. Carrier aviation invested heavily in training, evaluation, safety, tactical schools, large force exercises, and technical mastery. The result was an extraordinarily capable professional community.
Which is why the cultural critique has to be careful. Excellence is not the problem. The problem is when excellence inside the accepted framework becomes the test of whether the framework itself is correct.
The Tailhook Association, founded in 1956, became one institutional expression of the naval aviation community through professional gatherings, publications, and social networks. The word tailhook itself also became shorthand for the carrier aviation identity built around arrested landings, shared risk, and demanding standards.
And because we are carrying this story through 1991, we cannot use tailhook culture as a neutral phrase and stop there.
The Gulf War seemed at first to provide a triumphant ending to the Cold War carrier story. During Desert Shield, carriers supplied immediate combat power while the coalition built land-based strength. During Desert Storm, 6 U.S. carriers ultimately participated in the theater, and naval aviation flew thousands of combat sorties as part of the Joint Air Campaign.
Visually, it looked like closure. Tomcats, intruders, Hornets, Hawkeyes, Prowlers, precision weapons, massive flight decks, and a technologically dominant joint force defeating Iraq with extraordinary speed.
Carrier aviation performed professionally. But here's the caveat. Desert Storm also exposed limits that the victory narrative could obscure. The Joint Air Tasking Order was enormous, and Navy carriers initially had difficulty receiving and processing it because communication systems were not fully compatible with the architecture used ashore. Integration improved, but friction was real.
That is an important detail. The carrier could launch modern aircraft from a nuclear-powered floating airfield and still struggle with the information plumbing connecting it to the joint campaign. High technology does not remove organizational friction. It relocates it.
Mine warfare offered an even sharper reminder. On February 18, 1991, Tripoli struck an Iraqi mine. Hours later, the Aegis cruiser Princeton struck 2 influence mines and was badly damaged. These were not Soviet saturation missile attacks. They were comparatively inexpensive mines disrupting some of the world's most sophisticated naval forces.
And that matters. Mehan would have recognized the lesson immediately. Control of the sea is never an abstraction. A carrier can dominate the sky above it and still depend on safe water underneath it.
Desert Storm therefore validated many things: training, readiness, power projection, joint adaptability. But it did not validate the Cold War carrier force against the Soviet anti-carrier system it had been designed to confront.
And in January 1991, just before the air war began, the Navy suffered another institutional shock: cancellation of the A-12 Avenger II, the planned stealth replacement for the A-6 Intruder. The Pentagon terminated what Navy historical accounts describe as the largest weapons contract cancellation to that date.
There is an echo of Episode 79 there. In 1949, cancellation of United States forced naval aviation to fight for its place in the future. 42 years later, the A-12 cancellation again raised questions about cost, technology, requirements, and what the next generation of carrier strike should look like.
Then, 7 months after Desert Storm, came Tailhook 1991.
At the Tailhook Association's September convention in Las Vegas, widespread sexual harassment and assault occurred. A later Department of Defense Inspector General investigation identified 90 victims of indecent assault, 83 women and 7 men, and documented serious failures of leadership and accountability. The scandal rocked the Navy and Marine Corps aviation community, damaged careers, and forced years of institutional scrutiny.
Just to be clear, this is not a side story to tack on to the end because the date happens to fit. It belongs here because the episode is about institutional identity. The same year that seemed to affirm naval aviation's operational competence also exposed severe failures inside the culture surrounding that community.
Tactical excellence and healthy institutional culture are not the same thing. An organization can be brilliant at its assigned military tasks and still possess blind spots in leadership, accountability, and professional norms.
And success can make those blind spots harder to see from inside. That does not mean every naval aviator shared the behavior exposed at Tailhook, nor that the professional achievements of the carrier force disappear. It means institutional prestige cannot substitute for institutional self-examination.
In that sense, 1991 provides a more complicated ending than victory alone. Desert Storm showed what the carrier force could do under favorable maritime conditions. The mine strikes showed that simpler threats still mattered. The A-12 cancellation revealed technological and acquisition limits. Tailhook revealed cultural failure.
4 different lessons in 1 year. History rarely gives you a cleaner warning against declaring the argument finished.
Across the Cold War, the aircraft carrier repeatedly adapted to national strategy. In Vietnam, it became a remarkably durable instrument of sustained and politically controllable air power. Tactical failures produced real learning, most visibly through the ALT report and TOPGUN. Pocket money demonstrated that carrier aviation could still perform distinctly maritime missions with strategic consequence.
The Soviet challenge then forced the Navy to recover a harder idea. Sea control could not be assumed. Maritime Strategy put carriers back into a contested ocean problem, protected by networks, escorts, submarines, fighters, and layered defenses, and used them aggressively to impose dilemmas on a peer opponent.
Broadly, yes, but I'd make one final distinction. That carrier-centered approach was not merely bureaucratic inertia. It was a defensible answer to the strategic and technological conditions of the late Cold War. But because the Soviet confrontation ended without major naval combat, crucial assumptions about survivability and system resilience remained untested.
And the deeper institutional lesson is not carriers were bad or the Navy stopped thinking. It is almost the opposite. Naval aviation became so capable, so professional, and so central to American power that its success carried cultural weight. The carrier became not simply a ship, but a way the Navy understood itself.
Right. That identity generated excellence. It could also narrow debate.
Which is why the Cold War carrier is such a useful military history case. The interesting question is never only whether a weapon works. Ask what conditions make it work. Ask what organization grows around it. Ask what success teaches. And then ask what success allows people to stop questioning.
Somewhere, Clausewitz is relieved that he did not have to compete with an air tasking order.
He would have written another 600 pages about friction and demanded better maps. That wraps up our 2-part look at the aircraft carrier in the Cold War. If you missed episode 79, start there for the post-World War II crisis, the nuclear mission, the revolt of the admirals, the jet age transition, and Korea. And check the show notes for our earlier episodes on Mahan, interwar carrier development, World War II carriers, the submarine war against Japan, and the merchant marine.
For further reading, James Holloway's Aircraft Carriers at War provides an operational perspective across Korea, Vietnam, and the Soviet confrontation. Edward Merolda's Histories of the Navy in Vietnam are indispensable for the Southeast Asia story. John Lehman's Command of the Seas presents an important advocate's view of the late Cold War naval buildup and maritime strategy. John Hattendorf and Peter Swartz are valuable for understanding the development of maritime strategy, while Carl Bilder's The Masks of War is useful for thinking about service identity and institutional preference.
We also have links in the show notes to the Mill History Talk Substack, where you can find articles, references, images, and the kind of additional detail that makes Brian happy and ruins my plan to have a normal-sized reading list.
Normal is not a recognized category in naval bibliography.
Follow the show, share the episode with the person in your life who says Carrier Battle Group at dinner, and join us next time. I'm Hope.
And I'm Brian.
This has been Mill History Talk, where history is not just what happened. It is what people learned from it, what they missed, and what happens when you put 6 aircraft carriers in one place and the Air Force is in charge.